Can you hear me? Yes, excellent. Good. I was told, I learned yesterday you're not supposed to tap a mic, it's bad for them. From a very funny woman called Maysoon Zayed, who, if you haven't seen, by the way, she's an amazing person. I think she's performing tonight in Arabic and tomorrow in English at the Art Center. So tonight, very different subject, the subject of peace and conflict resolution, Peaceland. Titles up there. Conflict resolution and everyday politics of international intervention. I'd like just to say a few words about the fact that the peace and conflict resolution is a subject that is very dear, I know, to the Vice-Chancellor Bloom's heart, and something that we're trying to build up at NYU Abu Dhabi, eventually perhaps, to build a peace institute. And so that this talk is part of that initiative. We like to put on lectures that follow up themes that we've listened to and about before, and we continue these themes through the years. So to give you an idea, in March 2016, Samina Ahmed was here from the International Crisis Group to talk about Pakistan and Afghanistan, the fog of war, prospects for peace. Lakhdar Brahimi was here in December 2015. Of course, he was a peace envoy to Syria, and it was a rather grim talk, but obviously it was a privilege to have him here and to listen to him face to face, as it were. Martin Griffiths was here in February 2015, talking about Russia and the Ukraine, and he's from the European Institute of Peace. Tonight we're lucky to have Severine Autesserre here. I was thinking about peace and human nature as I was thinking about tonight's introduction. I just remembered that I got to think about Tolstoy and the fact that he begins, famously, of course, it's his novel Anna Karenina with the famous, what seems almost like a Hippocratic aphorism that all families are happy in the same way, but they're unhappy in different ways. And I wondered if there isn't some secret of human nature that related to that makes peace or conflict resolution so difficult, that because they are not always the same kinds of conflicts. Although I do like to believe that although human beings seem to have an instinct for making war, they also have an instinct to want to make peace. So those are just thoughts. The expert is the person I'm now going to introduce, Professor Severine Autesserre, who is an expert, as I say, in war, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, and African politics. She currently works as professor, as you can see up there, of political science, specializing in international relations and African studies at Barnard College, which is part of the Columbia University system. She's written 2 award-winning books, in fact, more than one award, and a series, numerous articles. Her latest book, Peaceland, Conflict Resolution and the Everyday Politics of International Intervention, published with Cambridge, examines how everyday practices, habits, and narratives influence the effectiveness of peace-building interventions on the ground. A previous book, The Trouble with the Congo, Local Violence and the Failure of International Peacebuilding, also published at Cambridge, focuses on local violence and international intervention in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Professor Autesserre is currently researching a new project that examines successful international contributions to local and bottom-up peacebuilding. Before becoming the professor that she now is, she worked for humanitarian and development agencies in Afghanistan, Kosovo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nicaragua, and India. She had a postdoc, which she held at Yale, after gaining her PhD in political science from New York University, so she's one of us. And she got a master's degree in international relations and political science from Columbia University before that, and studied at Sciences Po before that. It's a great pleasure to invite Severine Autesserre to the podium.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for being here today. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to present my latest book on international peace building at NYU Abu Dhabi. Not only because it's my first time in this part of the world, but also because, as you heard, I'm an NYU grad, so it feels a little bit like going back home. And so let me tell you a few words about what motivated my project, what got me started, and 5 years later eventually resulted in my new book, Peaceland. I have spent the past 15 years, or 17 years now, studying international peace-building initiatives. And I've done that mostly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, so I'm going to show you a map in a few minutes to show you where Congo is. So I've done that mostly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I've also worked on many other African and non-African countries. And during my fieldwork, I constantly witnessed a puzzling pattern, which is that international interveners kept using, reproducing, and perpetuating ways of working that they themselves widely viewed as ineffective or even detrimental to peace building. So for instance, and first let me tell you, by peace building, I mean any and all actions that help promote peace during, before, during, and after a conflict. So when I say peace building, I include all of the actions that United Nations officials would usually categorize as peacemaking, peacekeeping, and also long-term peace building. For me, everything comes together. And by interveners, I mean expatriates, foreigners who work in conflict zones. So that includes donors, diplomats, peacekeepers, other United Nations staff members, and the foreign staff of international and non-governmental organizations. So now let me give you a couple of examples of these kind of puzzling patterns that recur wherever you are in the world. It is now conventional wisdom that local ownership is essential for successful peace building, but local stakeholders are rarely included in the design of international programs. Scholars and practitioners regularly emphasize that using universal peace-building templates is ineffective, and that it's very important to adapt the activities to the local context. And yet, interveners often use models that have worked in other conflict zones, but that are not appropriate for the specific local conditions. Local people and interveners themselves deplore the expatriates' tendency to live in a kind of bubble where they interact mostly with other expatriates and where they lack contact with host populations. And yet, this phenomenon still recurs in virtually all areas of intervention. Why? And to me, the persistence of these inefficient modes of operation is all the more puzzling because interveners are not indifferent or callous. Most of them care a lot about the effectiveness of their actions. They're not stupid. Most of them are intelligent, well-read, well-educated people. Some of them even have a master's or a PhD from NYU or from Columbia University. And the problem is not even that they are oblivious to the consequences of their standard practices. Some of them are actually very uncomfortable with the way international peace building operates on the ground. So, my book is an attempt at understanding why interveners contribute to perpetuating modes of operation that they know, that we all know, are inefficient, ineffective, even counterproductive. What I also found striking when I was in the field is that a number of individuals and organizations ignore or even actively challenge the international peace builders' dominant practices. And these people suggest alternative modes of operation. The existence of these exceptional cases raises two questions for me. First, what can we learn from them in terms of increasing the effectiveness of international peace building? And second, why haven't they managed yet to convince their colleagues to adopt the alternative modes of operation that have proved to be more effective? So, identify identifying the factors that impact the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building is of critical importance for scholars like me, for practitioners, and obviously for people living in conflict zones. Because it's true that interventions can succeed only when warring parties are ready to stop using violence, and when local, national, and regional peace-building capacities are strong enough to make peace sustainable. But despite their limitations, external contributions can make the difference between war and peace. There has been a number of studies at the macro level and also at the very micro level that have shown that international support significantly increases the chances of successful peace building. And so when you look at the usual explanations for the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building, you see that they usually focus on three kinds of themes. First, they focus on material constraints. For instance, whether or not peace builders have enough funding to implement all of the projects that are necessary to re-establish peace. Second, they also focus on vested interests. That is, peace builders prioritize either the pursuit of peace, which increases peace-building effectiveness, or they prioritize the pursuit of their own national, political, economic, organizational, professional, military, security interests, and as a result, their project effectively promote these vested interests, but they have little effect on the actual construction of peace. And the last kind of explanation focuses on the imposition of liberal templates and values. Many scholars argue that Western liberal values orient interventions towards strategies that are ill-adapted to local conditions, and that this leads to peace-building failures, while interventions that are culturally appropriate are much more effective. Well, what I found in my research, and the central message of the book, is that the everyday dimensions of international peace-building initiatives on the ground also strongly impact the effectiveness of intervention efforts. And by everyday dimensions, I really mean mundane elements. I mean the expatriates' social practice, their standard security procedures, their habitual approaches to collecting information on violence. I also look a lot at the influence of personal relationships and informal practices on formal professional initiatives. And in my book, I show that these everyday practices shape the overall intervention from the bottom up. They enable, they constitute, they help reproduce the macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, and discourses that other political scientists usually study. They also explain the existence and the perpetuation of ways of working that interveners themselves widely view as inefficient, ineffective, even counterproductive. And I want to clarify from the start that my approach and existing explanations are not mutually exclusive, but rather they're complementary. And another important point is that my argument is not that we should eliminate interventions altogether. There is, in fact, a wide consensus among scholars and host populations that external support and external expertise are often, not always, but often necessary for successful peace building. Foreign interveners have a number of distinct advantages when they are deployed on the ground in conflict zones, and I've listed the most important of these advantages on this slide. So what we need is not to forfeit these contributions, but rather to think about how we can increase the effectiveness of international peace efforts. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to tell you a few words about my theory and research methods and about the main contributions of my analysis. And then I'll spend most of the time talking to you about my findings. So first, I will explain how interveners construct knowledge of their areas of deployment And I will trace the impact that this process of knowledge construction has on peace-building effectiveness. So it sounds very abstract and very boring, the way I say it, but I promise it's fascinating and it's not abstract at all. And then I will look at the everyday routines that make possible the counterproductive practices and narratives that I analyze in the first part of the talk. And again, I will look at the impact of these everyday routines on peace-building effectiveness. And I will conclude by emphasizing again the policy implications of my analysis. But first, a few words on peace-building and the research on peace-building. I think that there are two major problems with the existing research on international peace-building. The first problem is that most scholars focus on capital cities, headquarters, and on the dynamics of interventions at the national and international levels. While, in fact, field-based peace builders enjoy substantial leeway in implementing their on-the-ground operations. Because the instructions from capital cities and headquarters must always be interpreted, and because there is often a very wide divide between field offices and capital cities and headquarters. So it's very important to analyze the specific dynamics of on-the-ground peace building. The other major gap is that most analysts focus on macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, and discourses. And this focus on the macro level creates two significant research gaps that a focus on the everyday practice of peace building on the ground will fill. First, we know a lot now about macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, discourses, but as of now, we know much less about the nuts and bolts of peace building. The banal, the everyday activities that actually make up the bulk of the peace building work. The other major gap is that we have many fascinating ethnographic analyses of how the cultures and practices of host populations can promote or impair effective peace building. But as of now, we know much less about how the daily lives of the interveners, their social circles, and the way they approach their work on an everyday basis actually influence macro-level actions and strategies. And a few scholars have started looking at this topic in recent years, but they focus on humanitarian aid, democratization, space and security, or local ownership. So with my book, I want to contribute to this emerging body of literature by drawing up a portrait of the interveners with their behaviors, customs, everyday lives, and practices. And this approach produces findings that are different from those of existing research. Existing research on international peace building emphasizes differences between interveners. A number of political scientists and anthropologists have shown that different cultures orient the strategies of various organizations, countries, and professional groups in dissimilar ways. So this precludes the coordination that could achieve coherent strategies, and therefore it decreases the overall effectiveness of the international peace efforts. So that's true, but at the same time, my research highlights commonalities among interveners. And in contrast to the body of research on the liberal peace, I show that these commonalities reside less in shared representations like a shared liberal values or a shared liberal agenda, but instead they are primarily rooted in the everyday practice of peace building on the ground. And this new finding suggests a fresh answer to the question of what affects the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building. I argue that the everyday practice of peace building on the ground is just as important to study as the content or the ideological dimensions of the programs. And so to document the influence of the everyday on international peace building initiatives, my research strategy has been to spend more than a year in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you can see Congo here on the maps. And I did an ethnographic study of a community of interveners who were based in the province of North Kivu, which at the time of my research, and it actually still is the most violent province of the Congo right now. And because it is so violent, it hosts a very wide variety of interveners who come from all kinds of national, professional, organizational, and religious backgrounds. But while this in-depth ethnographic analysis gave me access to the culture of the interveners, I needed to distinguish between those collective understandings that are shared only by peace builders who are deployed in Congo, from those that are shared by all peace builders, independently of where they are deployed. So I conducted research visits to other theaters of intervention to assess the generalizability of my findings from the intervention in Congo. I did research in South Sudan, Burundi, Cyprus, Israel and the Palestinian territories, and Timor-Leste. And if you're interested, I'm happy to explain during the discussion why I chose these cases as shadow cases for my research. And I also built on my own experience as an intervener in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Congo, and Nicaragua, and obviously on practitioners' report and academics' writings on many other international interventions. And in my main field slides, I collected 4 kinds of data to develop my analysis. So field observations in various conflict zones, something like, I think I have more than 3 years of field observations. I have 294 in-depth interviews with all kinds of interveners and with local authorities, local staff, local populations. And that's in addition to 330 interviews that I had conducted for a previous project on peace building for my first book. And for this project, I also interviewed interveners, but also perpetrators of violence, victims of violence, business people, I mean, all kinds of people. So interviews, analysis of multiple documents, of course. And also what was really, really useful for this project was what we call participant observations, which included things like patrolling with United Nations peacekeepers, and implementing reconciliation projects with non-governmental organization staff members. So this, I really like this picture because that's me trying to pass as a blue helmet and going on patrol, you know, with the peacekeepers who were behind me. And I find this photo really funny because at the time, I really thought that I was passing for a blue helmet and I was passing for a peacekeeper, and I was so proud of myself during the whole patrol. Now, you have to realize that it was an Indian contingent, and Indian women were not allowed to work as peacekeepers in Congo because it was too dangerous. So first I had a gender problem. It was really difficult for me just to pass for an Indian peacekeeper. But the thing that was even more problematic, at least from that picture, is that if any of you has a military background, you can see the problem here. My bulletproof jacket is the wrong way. And I kept patrolling, like being super proud, but being like, this is heavy and it doesn't protect anything. I really wonder why they're carrying these things around. And nobody told me anything. And it was only when we were back to the base that people were like, well, you know, you should have put it the other way. Okay. Anyway, so that's me being a good ethnographer and really trying to do things like a peacekeeper. But let me focus on what's really, really interesting, which is the findings. So the first part of my book traces how interveners construct knowledge of their areas of deployment. And I first focus on the struggle over which and whose knowledge matters in peace building. In the current international system, the most valued expertise is that of interveners trained in peace building, humanitarian, and development techniques, and with extensive experience in a variety of conflict zones. In contrast, the interveners who stay too long in a specific place are considered to have gone native, and they are thus discredited. The consequence is that of all the expatriate peace builders that I met, only a few had pre-existing knowledge of their countries of deployment. So, valuing thematic expertise. So thematic expertise will be something like knowledge of human rights or gender issues or election organizations. So valuing thematic expertise over local knowledge results from various social dynamics, including the process of professionalization of international peace building, which has increased the effectiveness of intervention programs on the ground. But valuing thematic expertise over local knowledge also results in standard ways of working in the field that decrease the overall effectiveness of the international peace efforts. For instance, it legitimates the deployment of people who do not speak any of the local languages, even though on the ground, everyone identifies the intervener's lack of linguistic ability as one of the main obstacles to effective peace building. It also leads to high rotation among interveners, which has a lot of negative consequences, like lack of institutional memory and a lack of understanding of local contexts. Even more importantly, valuing thematic expertise over local knowledge also asserts the superiority of the international staff who are viewed as having the consequential knowledge of our local employees. In virtually all aid and peace-building organizations, whether diplomatic, international, or non-governmental, expatriates are in management positions and local people make up the staff. Very few local people make it into leadership positions in their countries of origin. To move up the hierarchy, they have to go abroad and become expatriates. And let me tell you a story that illustrates how the very fact of being local changes the way interveners relate to a person and his ideals. So one of my interviewees, Michel, was a Congolese businessman. He's still a Congolese businessman. And Michel is from a mixed background. He has Belgian, Congolese, and Portuguese ancestors. And Michel was very frustrated by the way interveners behaved toward him and toward other Congolese elites during meetings. He thought that interveners were talking down to local counterparts and that they didn't take local ideas into account. So during a meeting abroad, Michel conducted an experiment. Instead of introducing himself as Congolese, as he usually did, he pretended that he came from Puerto Rico. And the approach in the meeting was completely different. He had much more credibility and much more influence when he passed as an outsider. Another consequence of the fact that intervention structures value thematic expertise so much more than local knowledge is that intervention organizations very rarely solicit local input in the design and plannings of their efforts. And this approach creates resentment among local people, and it is at the root of the phenomenon of local contestation, resistance, and adaptation that leads to the failure of so many projects and programs, and that other scholars like Oliver Richmond and Roger McGinty have documented so well. So, of course, local partners regularly resist international programs for their own benefits. For instance, because they want to pursue their own personal, economic, political, social, military, security agendas, or just because they don't care about building peace. But not all local people have this kind of vested interest. And instead, many of them truly care about building peace in their countries, and most of them would truly benefit from very successful international peace-building programs and for more stable conditions. So it's really important that we understand why the people who would in fact benefit from successful international peace-building programs instead reject or distort them. And the main reason is the premium that interveners place on thematic expertise over local knowledge. In all of the countries in which I worked, local stakeholders complained that international peace builders were, and I quote, arrogant, and that they provided aid in a humiliating manner. And my interviewees emphasized that the arrogance resided in thinking that the international ways of working is better than the local ones, and in failing to pay attention to local ideals. And what's absolutely critical for the research on peace building is that I heard these kind of criticisms against all kinds of international programs and all kinds of international projects. So not only those that were obviously shaped by liberal values, like programs that, for instance, insist upon organizing elections, but I also heard these criticisms against programs that had absolutely no relationships with Western or liberal values, like programs that build foreign rather than local models of toilets to respond to water and sanitation emergencies. And my interviewees were very clear. They said that they do not resist or reject the international programs because of their content, such as the supposed Western or liberal characters of the program. Instead, they reject the very act of imposition, regardless of whether or not they like the strategies and the values that the programs convey. And the international and non-governmental organizations that fight against these trends are excellent illustrations of the advantages inherent to valuing local knowledge on par with thematic expertise. The few comparative evaluations of their efforts that exist show that these organizations are much more effective at promoting programs that are locally owned and locally supported, and therefore effective and sustainable. So the next chapter of the book studies the everyday manner in which, in these circumstances, the international peace builders, those that are not exceptions, make sense of their environments. And I showed that interveners face multiple obstacles when they try to collect and analyze data on their areas of deployment. And I traced the key consequences of the resulting lack of understanding of local contexts. And one of these key consequences is that the lack of understanding of local conditions regularly entices international peace builders to rely on simple and often overly simplistic narratives to design their intervention strategies. So simplistic narratives will be something like, the war in Afghanistan, everything is about drugs and religion. Or the war in Colombia, it's all about drugs as well. Or the war in Congo is an ethnic war, or the war in Sudan is an ethnic war. So adopting these dominant narratives offers a useful way out of the predicament that international peace builders face, given the poor quality of the information and analysis that they have. Dominant narratives emphasize a few themes on which to focus. And interveners can then believe that they have a grasp of the most important features of the situation, instead of feeling lost and deprived of the knowledge that they need to properly accomplish their work. But I developed an in-depth case study of the impact of dominant narratives on the conflict in Congo to illuminate the perverse consequences of this practice. So, in brief, in 2010 and 2011, when I was doing the research for the book, but even still now, three narratives dominate the discourse on Congo, and they orient the intervention strategies there. And they focus really on three themes. The first one is that they emphasize a primary cause of violence, the illegal exploitation and trafficking of natural resources, like gold, diamond, coltan, etc. The second is a main consequence, sexual abuse of women and girls. You've probably heard of Congo before, and usually it's associated to things like it's the rape capital of the world. And the third narrative is state building, a main solution, reconstructing state authority. So these narratives achieved prominence because they offered straightforward explanations for the violence. They also suggested feasible solutions, and they resonated with foreign audience. And thanks to the reliance on these dominant narratives, foreign and Congolese elites have managed to put the Congolese conflict on the agenda of influential decision makers in capital cities and headquarters. So that's brilliant, it's fantastic. The problem is that the reliance on these dominant narratives and on the solutions that they recommended has also led to results that clashed with their intended purposes, including an increase in human rights violations on the ground. The focus on mineral resource exploitation has diverted attention from other causes of violence, and thus it has decreased the overall effectiveness of the international peace efforts. The focus on sexual abuse has raised the status of sexual exploitation. It has transformed it into an effective bargaining tool for combatants, and therefore it has increased the use of sexual violence on the ground. And finally, the focus on state building has merely enabled the Congolese government and the Congolese army to become more effective perpetrators of human rights violations against Congolese populations. And of course, a number of Congolese people I interviewed for the project, in addition to the exceptional interveners that I mentioned before, all of these people have tried to reintroduce more complexity in our analysis of Congo, but thus far with very little success. So the second part of the book looks at the everyday routines that make possible the counterproductive practices and narratives that I just told you about. And I look again at the intended consequences of these routines, such as enabling interveners to function in conflict zones and enabling their organizations to help the host country build peace. But I also look at the unintended consequences, notably the fact that these everyday routines construct and maintain firm boundaries, a firm separation between interveners and local people. And the fact that they perform, they make visible, they perpetuate, and they reinforce an image of the intervener's superiority over local people, which these local people obviously strongly resent. So, for the sake of time, let me focus on the three elements that are the most influential in constructing the boundaries, the separation between interveners and local people. The first element is that interveners share a common official goal: to help the country of intervention and its people. And that's something very clear in the quote that I put at the top of the slide. Here, we're all part of a club, we're all here to help Congo. And there are, of course, numerous internal differences in the process of reaching this common goal. There are also different degrees of motivation. But the shared objectives delineate the boundaries of the interveners group. It defines who belongs to the community and who does not belong to the community. Foreign business people, for instance, are excluded for the simple reason that they do not share the same official goal. And so the interveners group include people who come from all kinds of national, organizational, professional, and religious backgrounds. And what's important is that the presence of this community of interveners does not preclude the existence of the internal divisions and tensions that other scholars have documented. And if you're interested, I'm happy to explain during the discussion how the similarities coexist with the differences. But what's really interesting is that on the ground, two elements transform this loose group with a lot of internal divisions and tensions into an actual block with firm boundaries. The first element is that interveners share a common experience of life in conflict zones. And that goes well beyond the shared characteristics that we all know about. Like the fact that interveners drive in big SUVs, that they have favorite bars, inside jokes, favorite topics of discussion. Beyond these superficial characteristics, I show that the feeling of belonging to a specific group is rooted primarily in the fact of being a foreigner, living and working with no family life, constant fear, lack of basic facilities, and usually a job that is emotionally draining. And the quote that I put on the slide is typical of what I heard during my interviews and what I observed and experienced during my fieldwork. In war situations, you're in it together, in a country that you do not know, where people speak other languages that you do not understand. We interveners, we interact with local people all day long, but there are times when you want to eat your own food, speak your own language, listen to your own music. And at that point, my interviewee stopped and she looked me in the eyes and she said, "You and I, we have millions of things in common." And you have to realize, I've never met this person before. And very clearly, we have completely different backgrounds in terms of national origin, profession, organizational affiliations. And yet she tells me, "You and I, we have millions of things in common. You and Congolese, you have 2 or 3 things in common apart from work." This is why the expats go together. Because the expats in any country need to have a place where they can go and sit down just so that they are in their own world. It is necessary to keep you sane and anchored. And I heard this kind of deep, very emotional talk from all kinds of interveners, no matter where they came from, which functions they had, and what organizations they worked for. The other element that helps reinforce the feeling of community, despite all of the internal divisions and tensions, is the presence of others against whom interveners can construct their group identity. And these others are notably the so-called locals, meaning the local authorities and populations who are the intended beneficiaries of the international intervention. And again, I think that's something very clear from the quote on the slide. You and I, we have millions of things in common. You and Congolese, you have 2 or 3 things in common apart from work. And it's important to note that local people share responsibility for the separation that exists between them and interveners. In many settings, local people treat all expatriates as alike and separate from themselves, regardless of the intervener's national origin, profession, and organizational affiliations. And this reinforces the sense of community among interveners, and it further widens the split between the 2 groups. Local people also often make it extremely difficult for international interveners to integrate in their local communities. And that's something that's, again, very clear, I think, from the quote that I put on the slide. So I'm going to let you read it, but I want to tell you why I think this quote, I love this quote, because this is a quote from one of the exceptional interveners that I had interviewed. He had spent 8 years in Congo. He had learned local languages. He had tried to develop strong friendship with Congolese people. He had married a Congolese woman, and he had a child who was half Congolese. And yet, as you can see here, he felt that only his wife and his immediate relatives fully accepted him, while none of his other contacts did. And that's a complaint that I heard many times when I was talking with the interveners who tried to break the boundaries, the separation between them and local people. And my point here is that turning to other expatriates for support is a perfectly understandable response to the daily difficulties of working on the ground in conflict zones. It enables interveners to function in the difficult environments that they face. But this habit also has counterproductive consequences that decrease the overall effectiveness of the international peace efforts. And there are many other everyday routines that interveners have to follow on the ground just to be able to live and work in every day. Lots of routines that actually have the same kind of counterproductive consequences. Take the very fact of having to help be your primary objective and identifying local authorities and populations as beneficiaries. Well, this actually embodies a claim to the moral high ground. And that was something evident in the saying that constantly recurred in my interviews in Burundi, South Sudan, and Congo. The hand that gives is always higher than the hand that receives. Take also the interveners' security routines, such as driving with the doors locked and the windows closed, or living in these big compounds with a lot of barbed wires around them. Well, these security routines, again, are perfectly understandable responses to danger, right? But at the same time, they further separate expatriates from local people. In the words of a Kenyan interviewee, they transform expatriates into other kinds of human beings. They also reinforce the data collection and analysis problems that interveners face, because they curtails the interveners' understanding of the local realities that they want to change. And in the book, I look at many other everyday practices and narratives, such as striving to remain neutral and impartial, advertising actions, perpetually writing reports, and quantifying the results of actions. And again, I show that all of these routines are perfectly understandable responses to the daily difficulties of intervening on the ground in conflict zones. But these habits have numerous counterproductive consequences that decrease the chances of success of international efforts. And again, the interveners who develop personal and social relationships with their local counterparts, who forego standard security routines, who avoid advertising their actions, basically the interveners who break the patterns that I just told you about, these people end up implementing projects that are much more effective. So overall, my project and my book suggest a new approach to the study of international peace building. An approach focused on the everyday practice of peace building on the ground. This new approach produces findings that are different from those of existing research. While existing research on international peace building emphasizes differences among interveners, my research highlights commonalities among them. And in contrast to the body of research on the liberal peace, I show that these commonalities reside less in shared values or shared representations, but they lie instead in the everyday practice of peace building on the ground. And these new findings suggest a fresh answer to the question of what affects the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building. Macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, and discourses are not the only determinant of peace-building effectiveness. The everyday practice of peace-building on the ground also matters tremendously. And it is by looking at these everyday practices and habits that we can understand why interveners contribute to perpetuating modes of operation that they know, that we all know, are inefficient, ineffective, even counterproductive. Everyday practices, habits, narratives are perfectly understandable responses to the daily difficulties of intervening on the ground in conflict zones. They enable interveners to function in the difficult environments that they face, but they also have numerous counterproductive consequences that decrease the overall effectiveness of the international peace efforts. And of course, I have developed a lot of policy recommendations based on this analysis. I have something like 30 pages of that in the book, but the time for my presentation is almost up, so I'm just going to take 1 minute to emphasize the main ideas. International interveners could rebalance the role of local and thematic knowledge by following the model of the exceptional organizations that I've mentioned during this talk. So concretely, that would mean changing recruitment and promotion practices for interveners, relying much more on local employees, and creating tools and structures to gather local input from intended beneficiaries and from local communities. We could also help break the boundaries between interveners and local people by promoting socialization between interveners and their local counterparts, by creating structures for better relationships between interveners and their local partners, and by convincing interveners to forego standard security routines and the requirement to advertise their actions. And local people could further help break these boundaries by changing the way they routinely interact with local peace builders. So this is a very brief summary of a 330-page book and of 15 years of research. So, of course, my analysis is much more detailed than what I've been able to explain in a 30-40 minutes presentation. And I'd be more than happy to give you more details on any of my points during the discussion if you're interested. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you, Professor, for amazing presentation. I learned a lot from it. My question is, from your research, not just in Congo, but also elsewhere during peacekeeping missions and operations like that, do you see, in your opinion, do you think language barrier is one of the major things that cause barriers between locals and interveners? Probably, from day-to-day life, because you mentioned that interveners come into the country without much understanding about the local situation. What about language? Do you think that's a problem?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the factors that create the barriers. The fact that they don't know anything about the country, and it's very difficult for them to learn because some of them don't speak the language. And when they do speak the language, for example, they're going to speak French. In Congo, that's the best case scenario. But French in Congo, you can interact with the elite, but you cannot interact with most of the population who speak Swahili or Lingala or one of the other languages. In South Sudan, most people spoke English. And I could go on and on. So it's rare to find people who speak the local languages, and it's definitely one of the barriers to communication. And to me, the really puzzling question is how comes that it ever occurred to someone that it was a good idea to send someone who doesn't speak a local language, who cannot communicate with the population, to send that person to a conflict zone and say, hey, he's going to build peace for you. Seriously, in what kind of so that's actually one of the things that prompted the whole book project. Is like, how did we arrive at a situation where it seems completely normal to send someone who doesn't speak local languages and expect that this person is going to be able to do something? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you again for your great presentation. My question is, if most, if not all, of the conflicts that you've studied are still ongoing, how do you measure whether or not these reforms are effective? Thank you.
Yes, so two ways. The first one is that there is a lot of variation within a country. And I'm not looking for my research, I'm not looking at the country level, but I look at the subnational level. And I look at the village level. And I can see a lot of variation between interventions in village A and intervention in village B, or intervention by a specific organization and interventions by other organizations. And that's where I think my analysis has a lot of purchasing power. It's really by looking at the variations when you look at neighboring villages or organizations that work in the exact same circumstances, but one of them managed to do something that actually promotes peace and the other one doesn't. So it's really subnational variation. And this question is actually what prompted my new book project, the one that I talked about at lunchtime for the political science seminar, is looking much more at the variation, but looking at the positive side of the spectrum. And how can we understand that sometimes it actually works?
Thank you for an interesting presentation and sharing information. But I'm just wondering if if the people who are working in the field are well-intentioned and they are intelligent and they know their specific areas, and this whole cycle is being perpetuated over and over, is there something happening maybe at a higher level? I mean, are the agencies themselves hiring people who they know are incapable, given the circumstances and the tools that they're being sent with, of really working on peace? And are systems, or are these big agencies perpetuating a system where they want to keep these kind of jobs internal for X, Y, Z categories of people? Because as you said, it's very evident, and peace building has been going on for decades now.
That's a question and actually an explanation for peace building effectiveness that I heard very often when I was conducting research in Congo, in Sudan, even in New York. People saying, well, it's so obvious that there are problems that it must be by design. There must be someone who actually doesn't want these missions to succeed. And every time someone told me something like that, I was like, okay, that's a really interesting explanation. Can you provide evidence for that? If there any evidence you can send me that it's actually something by design? And I've been looking for evidence for that for 15 years now, and nobody has ever been able to provide concrete evidence, to provide some kind of reliable evidence that yes, it's a design that we want the organizations to be ineffective. So that's why, to me, the explanation that's based on they actually want, even the headquarters of the organization, they really believe that by sending, an expert on gender, it's going to help with gender in Congo. And who cares if that person doesn't speak the local languages? She's an expert on gender, and she knows everything there is to know about gender. So there is really this idea that because they have expertise, they can do something, and that local context doesn't matter. And I think that it's not it's not something we can. I mean, I find it striking and shocking and funny as well. But on the other hand, when we think about it, we, the university system, we're guilty of that. And I place myself as part of the university system. I teach a class on war and peace. And I also teach a class on war and peace in Africa. That's the most specialized class that I teach. I don't teach a class on Congo. And I don't teach a class on North Kivu. When I tell my students to study languages, I tell them take French or Spanish or Mandarin, because these are the languages that will help you get a job better in the future. I don't tell them study Swahili or Lingala or Tetun. So I think that as professors, we also have, those of us who are professors in this room, we also have to think very carefully about what we tell our students and the kind of models, role models that we are, and the kind of things that we value in our teaching. Because when we train generalists and we think that when we keep telling people that area studies don't matter and that they shouldn't specialize on a specific country, then we're actually perpetuating the problems. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I'm from a war-torn country, which is Syria, and I was sitting once with my uncle towards the beginning of the conflict when there was a mission that visited from the United Nations to monitor the situation on the ground. And my uncle owned a restaurant in a very vibrant area that was full of tourists before the war started. And he was visited by a couple of people from that mission, and he was telling me the story proudly of how he kicked them out of the restaurant because he thought that, according to him, he's a person with very strong opinions, that they were imperialist tools that came to the country for serving other nations' sort of interests. So I wonder why, it's not a peace-building mission, obviously, but it's something that is an international mission, exactly. So I wonder if there is a role that plays, that the lack of trust from local people towards those peace-building mission plays in maintaining these barriers that exist between the peace builders and the local people. I mean, in the case of my uncle, for example, I've seen him being very friendly to other foreigners, but when it came to sort of international mission representatives, he was very upset about it and he didn't want to deal with them. So is that an element that plays in the role of,
yes,
the lack of trust?
It's definitely, this lack of trust is definitely one of the strong elements. And you remember toward the end of the talk, I was talking about the fact that local populations also share responsibility in the barriers between interveners and local people, and that's one of the things. It's the lack of trust, all of the suspicion, this idea. It's imperialist in Syria, in Congo and Sudan. What I hear is like, oh, they're just like the colonizers. They're coming back and they're recolonizing our country. So either the language of imperialism or the language of neocolonialism is something that I hear very often. And I understand where the suspicions come from, because also sometimes the interveners unknowingly reproduce the very behavior that the imperialist or the colonialist would use. So again, this idea that you know what's best for people and you're coming to help them and to develop their understanding. It sounds familiar, right? And also, again, these very everyday practices. In Congo, for instance, there is this town, Bukavu, that's part of the eastern violent provinces. And in Bukavu, there is this hotel that's absolutely beautiful, and that's the meeting place for all international interveners. That's the place you go out at night to have a drink because it's beautiful, it's quiet, and so on. You can guess what the origin of this hotel used to be. The colonial club. Used to be the club where the colonizers would go and meet at night to have a drink and to relax 70 years ago. So yes, the lack of trust and this idea that interveners or imperialists or neocolonialists are here to impose the will from the United States or France or different countries, something that I hear very often and that definitely contributes to the barriers between interveners and local people. Yeah. There is actually someone who's standing, and I'm so. No, go ahead first, and then the person who's standing, because I'm so impressed that you've been standing during the entire talk.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation, knowledge that you took us from this part of the world to another part of the planet or the globe where conflict is there, From experience in United Nations as I worked with them, but that was only in the development, sector, and we were trying to improve the quality of life for people, and in the sustainable development issues. And we try to maintain the quality of life for the, and the natural resources as well. Now, the thing is that whatever United Nations do, and whatever in a plan, the strategic, attitude towards the improvement of the people, especially in the places where there is a conflict, there are some hidden, I can say, hidden hands, hidden organization. They need to keep up the fire on, to keep the conflict in that places, as you mentioned in Congo, for example. There are some organizations where they feel that they keep for certain, income, or they improve their business. Now, my question is, from your, this research that you have done, what the main conclusion you came, taking Congo as an example, to other parts, whether in Africa or maybe in the Middle East, this conclusion that you came out, comparison between United Nations efforts and other, I can say, organization or another hidden, I can say, what you can mention it or you can name it. These things keep the conflict on for a longer time. What, in your opinion, what conclusion you came out
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yes, to me that's a question that goes back to the question that you asked at the beginning about what are the hidden agenda? Is there a strategic attempt to actually make the peace efforts fail? And to me that's yes. There are some organizations that are hidden or not hidden that actually very actively try organizations and countries that are actively and people within these countries that are actively promoting the conflict. And to me, these are not the people I'm talking to. Because these are people who are perpetrators of violence. What they want to do is to do violence, and maybe there is a way to change their mind. But what I actually want to know is the people who are actually trying to build peace, these people, how we can help them do something better. How we can help them just get rid of the negative consequences of their actions and be more effective. And this is why I think the example of Congo is useful, because it's not only Congo, it's also the 8 other conflict zones that I've studied, and I really show in the book that there are commonalities. It's not a Congo story, it's not a South Sudan story or a Timor story or an Israeli-Palestinian story. It's really a human being story. It's a human life story. There are commonalities among interveners wherever they are in the world, whatever the organization that they work for, whatever the goal of the organizations, and we can learn from these commonalities and think about ways to increase peace-building effectiveness. And so the main lesson that I learned is that if we pay more attention to the everyday dimensions of international peace-building, things that we think are mundane or not important, like who you're going to have a drink with at night, or a coffee or tea, how you're going to interact with people, the way you're going to talk to them, who you will decide to socialize with, how you will protect your security, how you will collect information, who you'll talk to, like all of these everyday decisions that don't seem very important. Actually, when you pay attention to them, you have a much better chance of being more successful at building peace.
Thanks so much for your excellent and very illuminating presentation. That was great, and thank you for the insight. Just touching off a question that one of the gentlemen asked earlier, and one of your areas of reform being that, if I can describe it, as a two-way street, encouraging local people to change the way they interact with interveners. And this might be generalizing a bit, but what do you think are the best ways of encouraging that change in behavior, if you can speak generally, and not just in terms of one conflict or another?
Right.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, there are things that are common in conflict zones. So, for instance, we were talking about lack of trust, and we were talking about resentment against interveners. It's something that I've seen in many different conflict zones, and there are programs to build trust. Just to, it goes through education, it goes through having many more interactions, and people and interveners, rather than staying in their bubbles, really trying to explain and to show what they are doing, rather than letting people imagine a lot of different things. And for local people, in many places that I've been to, it's something, kids who are like, hey, white person. Yeah, Okay, so it's funny the first time, right? It's funny the second day. It's kind of funny the third day. After a week, it gets a bit boring. After a year, it's really, 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 really alienating for international interveners. That's one of the things that make them, they don't want to go out anymore because they're so fed up. And that's completely understandable. And it's also completely understandable that the kids are like, and the adults sometimes are like, ha ha ha, that's really funny, he's different, he looks different. But that's something, again, that can be taught to I'm sure the kids and the parents don't realize the effect that it has on the other people. They don't mean anything bad. They're just reacting. But you can have the local teachers, the chief of village, just telling the population, just be more discreet. You want to stare, just like to have a peek and look at the person much more discreetly, because it's so alienating. Other things, like in many places, in many conflict zones that I've been to, the international interveners were complaining that they couldn't have everyday relationship, they couldn't socialize with local people because every time they were trying to make friends, people would end up asking them for something. So you're invited to someone's place and you're like, okay, I broke the barrier, that's great, you know, I'm being part of the environment, and you have dinner, and during the dinner you realize that actually they want help to, you know, they want some financial help, or they want help, they want you to help send the child to school, you know, something. They actually want something. And again, totally understandable when you look at the wealth differential between interveners and local people in general. Interveners have so much more in terms of money, in terms of access to education, to everything. But again, it's something that doesn't need to be that way. And people don't realize individually, of course it makes sense if you want to send your child to university abroad and you have someone finally who has an access, of course you're going to ask that. But they don't realize that every single person does it, and that it has a counterproductive effect when it adds up. And it adds up to the fact that interveners will just step back, and next time they're invited to dinner, they won't want to go. They won't want to socialize with local people because they're like, I'm not a walking money bag. And that's something that people told me very often. I'm not a walking money bag, and I'm so fed up of being treated like a walking money bag. So these are things that, again, there are educations, there are just very basic things, but that can improve relationships, I think, tremendously. Wow, so many people. Yes, with the hat. Oh, okay.
Myself? Thank
yes,
you.
please go ahead. And
Thank
then
you.
the lady with the hat, and then apparently that's going to be the last two questions.
That's very kind, thank you. We live in a very interconnected world, and news travels down to of international events, travels down to the very local level in all sorts of places. What has happened to the reputation of intervention due to the large neoconservative interventions of the last 17 years?
Yeah, the reputation of intervention, well, I think it goes back to what we've been talking about with already. I think that the reputation of interventions has become much more problematic. What I'm interviewed about, what journalists ask me questions about all the time, to me it's very representative of what the perception of interventions. People keep on asking me questions about sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers, as if any kind of peacekeeper was a rapist, and that you had to be very careful about them. And to me, that's really interesting, because of course there are only a minority of peacekeepers who are sexual abusers and sexual offenders. But not only journalists, but also when I'm at a dinner party and I say that I work on international peace building, I usually don't talk about work at dinner, but when people ask me questions, I say I work on international peace building, people start asking me questions about that, about exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers. And I think it shows that the reputation of peace builders have become increasingly problematic in the past 17 years, because of all of these interventions that we've had, and because of all of the scandals that we've had. And it's really sad, and it's also a huge part of the problem, as we've been discussing, for interventions for people who actually try to do a good job and actually try to help local populations, whether they work for the United Nations, for the French government, a non-governmental organization, the Saudi government, or whomever. So there was a lady with a hat that I promised the last question.
Hi, so thanks for your time. One of our class assignments was to read your article in African Affairs.
Nice.
And so in that article and in your talk, you describe that sexual violence as the dominant narrative. it neglects to include other acts of violence. And given that sexual violence can be a polarizing topic, I was just curious if you received any backlash or criticism for that position.
Yes, thank you. So basically, what the African Affairs article is what you remember when I was telling you about the dominant narratives, and I was taking the case study on Congo, and I said 3 dominant narratives. That's basically the book version of the article that I was telling you about. And so the argument I was making is we have these 3 dominant narratives, and one of them is all about sexual violence, but there is, there are other things apart from sexual violence. There are other forms of violence, and also we're always talking about sexual violence against women and girls, while there is sexual violence against men, and we shouldn't discriminate. And so I was expecting actually much more backlash because I was really worried when I published the article. I thought people would hate me, and I haven't received hate emails, thankfully. And it's been, I published the article now 5 years ago, so I think I'm kind of good. So I haven't received hate email, and I know that the article has circulated a lot. People told me afterwards when I was back to Congo that it circulated a lot in the community of interveners, and it prompted a very wide debate, and it was very, very contentious, but not in a bad way. It made people think, and some of them were convinced, some of them were less convinced, but at least it put the debate on the table, which I'm super, super happy. So the only actual backlash that I've seen, and it's actually a funny story to end, is one of my former interviewees who had become a friend. He worked for a donor agency in the Netherlands. And one day, he's the head of mission for a non-governmental organization who actually worked on sexual violence and had a lot of programs on sexual violence. So he forwarded my article, and he told the donor told the head of the non-governmental organization, you should read that, you should think about it, and you should talk about it with your staff. And so the head of the non-governmental organization replied and saying, well, she has no idea what she's talking about, and I completely disagree, and something like really mean. And I think she was trying to defend herself to the donor. The problem is that when the donor replied, he put me in copy of the reply. And so I read the entire thing. I was like, thank you. So that's going to be a good story to end, right? Thank you so much.